if the powers that be are in the wrong, it's your duty as a human, as a thinking human, to break the law.
Yeah.
So I grew up with that. Just from my earliest memories, I had the sense that, this idea that the cops were the bad guys and we were the good guys. And so I knew to lie to protect my parents.
Hello and welcome to Different Leaf, the podcast. I'm Britt Smith, happy to say I am now a successful first-time bud grower. So I've been tending to a couple of my own plants since we went into quarantine about 100 days ago and the rec shops closed down in Massachusetts. And those little plants have started flowering now and they're creating some juicy, crystally buds. This week, we're going to talk about how we got to this privileged era where we can have legal cannabis shops. And if they shut down because of a pandemic, we have laws in at least 17 states that allow us to grow marijuana at home without the fear of imprisonment. The untold histories that make up the roots of the American legal cannabis movement in the 70s are some of the best. They're the stories of trailblazers who questioned the world they were born into and what it told them about the marijuana plant. They're the people who stood out alone in their field and said, hey, maybe we were wrong. They're the people who got us to now. One of those people was Dr. Lester Grinspoon, a Harvard professor of psychiatry who wrote a book called Marijuana Reconsidered in 1971. His work eventually sparked the movement to legalize marijuana, and as one of the leading intellectuals in the US, he did it at great personal and professional cost. If you flip to page 41 in the first issue of Different Leaf, the magazine, you can read all about how Dr. Grinspoon's groundbreaking work got us to now. On Thursday, June 25th, the day after his 92nd birthday, Dr. Lester Grinspoon passed away peacefully with his wife of 66 years by his side. Different Leaf is sending love to friend of the show, his son, Dr. Peter Grinspoon, and his family, and we're forever grateful to Lester for being one of our beloved pioneers of pot. My guest this week is a woman who also grew up with a trailblazing parent at the root of the medical marijuana movement. Alia Volz is the author of the new book, Home Baked, My Mom, Marijuana, and the Stoning of San Francisco. Alia's mom, Meridy, was known to countless people in the city during the 1970s as the Brownie Lady. Yep, those kinds of brownies, the best kinds of brownies. Alia's mom ended up running the largest underground brownie business of the time, Sticky Fingers Brownies, which started out as a great way to make money and ended up being an essential medical supply for gay men in San Francisco during the AIDS epidemic. Alia's book is an account of dozens of people's memories throughout her mother's life, set to a very important political backdrop. She also goes into her own experiences growing up in a warehouse full of artists, hippies, and shaken bakers. As a kid of the mid-'80s myself, this book taught me so much about how many unsung heroes got us to this era of semi-legalization, where we widely recognize marijuana as a medicine to the point that it's considered an essential business during a pandemic. The little-known stories of some of the people who got us here are kind of amazing. Oh my gosh, your book, Alia, I couldn't put it down. It's not just like I learned so much from the history entwined throughout the story. It was also just really beautifully written. It was just like scenic, and it reminded me a lot of San Francisco. And I lived in the Bay Area a few years ago. I was actually out at Berkeley studying at UC Berkeley. And it was exactly how I thought San Francisco was going to be, the way you described it when I got there in 2015.
It's not that way anymore.
It's not. And I learned so much just through your book about exactly the changes that it's gone through and the gentrification in certain areas. And like, I didn't know, for instance, how it became kind of essential for gay people because of the military kind of offloading them there. Like, there was just so much I learned about the creation of San Francisco. So as well as it being a story about your mom and then how you kind of grew to be, it's also a story about the change of the city, which I really loved from your perspective.
Thank you.
You still live there, right?
Yes.
How do you like it now? It's changed so much.
I'm as heartbroken as anybody else, maybe more so. It's my hometown, but I feel like the city that I'm attached to on a heart and soul level it only emerges in whispers and memories and in people. There are still people who carry an older, more vibrant, more creative version of San Francisco with them. And so I still have those attachments. But other than that, I've been ready to leave for some time. I needed to finish this book. And my husband and I have been discussing for years moving out of the country. And we've been waiting for me to finish the book. Now this is done and we have a pandemic. So,
right.
So everything is on hold temporarily. It has proven to be a good place to be during the pandemic. Our governor and our mayor are conscientious and have acted early and often to protect the citizenry, even when the citizenry fails to protect itself. But it is a good place to be right now.
Yeah. And tell me about the process of writing the book, because you say that you had to stay just to finish it. Just from reading how many accounts went into this book, it seemed like it took a lot of stitching together to tell this story. What was it like?
Oh, it was a very long process, embarrassingly long. I started in 2006. It's 12 years between then and when the book sold and when I finished it. But it began as an oral history. So the first thing that I did was record all of these stories, dig up people from whatever corners of the world they're living in and ask for their memories. And I initially stitched those together into an oral history, which I shopped in 2009 and it didn't sell. Part of that, I think, was because I just hadn't matured enough as a writer to tell the story in the right way. And oral histories can be a little choppy to begin with. But the main comment that editors gave me at the time was that cannabis was too niche of a subject, that it would only interest this tiny section of the populace. And that changed 180 degrees.
Right.
By the time I went back out with it in 2018, and it sold quickly to a really good house. And I had a wonderful publishing experience from beginning to end. 10 years later.
Yeah, you really needed to wait for that moment in history, but there was, as you tell in the book, there was a lot that led up to that, and a lot of that involved your mum, especially on the West Coast. This is just an incredible story, I think, for people that grew up, in pretty square families like me. This was so fascinating, and you make reference to Alice in Wonderland a lot, which is funny because towards the end I started seeing you write it, and I'd been thinking it from the beginning of the book. I was like, she sounds like she's living in this, or she's going to live in this fantastical world, because you really start with your mum's kind of early life before you were even a twinkle. Can you tell us just a bit about how your mum started this massive brownie business on the West Coast?
Sure. So she grew up in a very conservative family as well, from Milwaukee, a good Jewish girl. She became radicalized, as so many people did during the Vietnam War protests at Madison, where she went. By the time she came to San Francisco, she was a full-blown hippie, and my mom is a very extreme person. So anything she does, she's going to do it in an outrageous and extreme way. And that's just her personality. So she was already kind of down the rabbit hole and experimenting with different kinds of drugs. And she was a working artist, but she was having a hard time making ends meet. And she met a woman who had a little business selling mostly not cannabis-infused baked goods on Fisherman's Wharf to the craftspeople. And when she had made enough money doing this and wanted to move to a commune in Scotland, she gave the business to my mom. My mom isn't interested in baking at all. She can't cook. It's every time she goes in the kitchen, it's just disastrous. So she found some friends to work with her. But also my mom was so much more interested in the cannabis brownie idea, and the woman who gave her the business had been selling a few on the side. And so pretty soon that became front and center, and the straight baked goods went by the wayside. My mom hit on this idea of delivering the brownies instead of selling them to passersby, having a regular route. And she only sold to people who were working in boutiques and bars and office buildings and even medical offices, all kinds of businesses.
And this is kind of the entrepreneurial side that you saw come out in her really early, is like she thought in a different way about how I can have almost like a captive audience that I can return to regularly. We can do this, in a sly way, and we don't have to say anything, and we just have an understanding. And it's like she just saw this market that was untapped. And I was like, that's genius. That's a genius way to do it. Yeah.
She was really ahead of her time with that. And I don't see my mom in many other ways as a businesswoman, but when she gets an idea, she really goes for it, as I said. And pretty soon she joined forces with my dad and her best friend, and some other people came into the business. And within a little more than a year of acquiring it, they were producing more than 10,000 brownies a month and delivering them all over the city. But the business model was also really clever in that people didn't know where the bakery was. They didn't have a fixed address because on each route, the customers would only see one salesperson. So customers didn't have a sense of how big it was either.
Right.
And I think that had a lot to do with avoiding the police, as they did. They never got busted. It was such a big operation, but they were hard to pin down because they were a moving target.
And also, as you grew up and she started to walk around with a baby in a stroller, dressing quite extravagantly, who's going to think that's a drug dealer? Sort of the perfect crime, It's really just a lady delivering baked goods.
Right. I don't think people even noticed the baked goods. Plus, the city was so colorful at the time that it wasn't unusual to see someone walking down the street in outrageous costumes. But that became part of their business model as well, was to dress in such flashy clothes that no one would think, it would be crazy to commit federal crimes looking like that while drawing that much attention to yourself. And it became a kind of cover. I can't remember who said this. There's a line I read somewhere that if you want people to ignore you, shout.
Yeah, I get it. What were your memories of that time when you were being kind of involved without realizing it in her business, really?
Yeah, I was really little. In that first phase, I was in the stroller. I was a toddler. So my memories, and I do have some, but they're really just flashes of moments. But what I do have is a feeling that comes up when I think of it. And there's also a really strong sense memory. Anytime, if I smell outdoor grown California Sinsemilla marijuana of a particular kind, 1970s style, it takes me back to early childhood, which is rather strange. And more specifically, smelling marijuana cooking together with chocolate. There's a science behind it where the olfactory center in the brain is located very close to the amygdala, which is involved in memory formation, and it's also involved in emotional response, which they think anyway is the reason why the sense of smell conjures such powerful memories, and especially from very early childhood, because that center of the brain forms first.
And you had so many smells going on in that warehouse. It sounded like the most incredible place. You had a dance floor suddenly when you were starting to learn to crawl, and these huge parties, and there was always cooking going on. And that must have been quite a memorable thing from a young age.
Yeah, really creative people. All of the people involved in the Sticky Fingers world were artists. They designed original packaging every week. So there was always art happening around the brownies. But then each of the people who lived there for whatever period had their own art practice. Walls would go up and come down, lofts would go up and come down. So it was this really free-form space, murals, costumes, mannequins, piñatas. It was just always full of color and creativity. And I've always felt that I was really fortunate to grow up in that aspect of the environment. Of course, there are drawbacks to having free-spirited parents, but that aspect of the environment is something that I always feel lucky to just have infused in at the most basic level in my core.
When you sort of moved a little later on in your childhood and you moved up out of the city, and a little more countryside.